Okay, exercise 19, the chordates. These are the type of animals that most people think of when we talk about studying animals. All these other organisms we've seen are animals, but they are not what people normally think of as animals. But here we go. Basically, chordata, that comes from the fact that we have a notochord. Now, this is our last group of organisms, the chordates here. Includes a pretty diverse group of organisms. These are some of the characteristics. Okay, they're deuterostomes, but there are four major characteristics of the chordata, and these are the ones that are really important. At some point in development, every animal that is a member of the phylum chordata has at some point a post-anal tail. Now that is in a lot of species as an embryo. Even humans, we have a tail as an embryo. We have all of these things as an embryo, but then the enzymes that maintain those anatomical structures are removed because genes switch off. And because genes switch off, those structures disappear in our embryos, and so generally we don't have them when we're born. Although there is the rare case of a child being born with a tail. At some point in the life, we all have a hollow dorsal nerve tube. In us, that will become our spinal column. At some point, we have what is called a notochord. It's primarily a cartilaginous rod made out of cartilage. In us, it becomes ossified and forms around the spinal column to protect it, and we call it a spinal column. And the fourth thing, at some point, we all had gills. It means we could breathe underwater. Again, we have functional gills as embryos, but they are not supported in the adult. Now, the most primitive group of chordates are these little things called tunicates. The mature one latches itself to substrates. You find these in coral reefs. There is a large larval form that's free swimming. Now, the larval form basically swims around. This helps dispersion. And they have on the mouth here, they have these little attachment points. When they get to a certain age, they'll latch on and grow into the adult form here, and they become filter feeders. So there's a mouth and anus, right? They still have gills because they breathe underwater. They have a very primitive brain. Let's see. Here's a tunicate larva and how it kind of progresses. So this guy, he swims around, and once he reaches a certain stage, he will latch on somewhere and slowly convert into the adult form. Okay. Here is a slide of a tunicate larva. You can see the little gill slits right there. You can see the notochord and nerve cord running down through the tail there. Here's another one, notochord, dorsal nerve tube. Now, this is our slide of a tunicate larva, and I've got several versions here. That's at a 4x objective. That's using the 10x objective. This guy is using the 40x objective, and you can see the attachment points. You can also see an eye spot. This helps it detect light or dark. And in the tail, you can see the notochord and the dorsal nerve cord running down through there. So we actually have a pretty good slide. Now, the next group we're going to look at are the cephalochordates. That means these are the chordates that have a head region. All right. The most primitive is called a lancelet, and it has like a enlarged area here called a brain. There's your dorsal hollow nerve cord, the notochord. You have these little gill slits in the pharyngeal region. Here's your tail. We have a model that we would look at in lab of this, showing the notochord and the nerve cord. We can see the pharynx there, the cirri, and this is one of the big keys to identify one of these guys. They don't have jaws. They just have these little cirri that help suck things into their digestive system. Here is how lancelets survive. They primarily spend most of their time buried in mud or a mud and sand substrate with the tentacles or the cirri up at the top and filtering out particles of food that are floating along into the water. Here is a lancelet, a slide of one. You can see the cirri, the gill slits, and you can see the intestines. You can also see the nerve cord and the notochord. Here, if we blow up the front part, you can see the cirri. That's the mouth. Right. Now we're going to go into a subphylum called the vertebrata. These are the organisms that are a little more advanced. Okay. Most chordates are vertebrates, and the subphylum itself comprises over 50,000 species of animals. We'll start right off the bat with, let's see, the agnathans. There is a group of vertebrates that do not have jaws. These are the most primitive vertebrates. Okay. Most of the forms are extinct. There's two groups left, hagfish and lampreys. Okay. Here is a lamprey larva. Now, they do have a mouth, but they don't have a jaw. Now, you could tell this apart from a lancelet because the lancelet has the little tentacles coming out, and the lamprey larva doesn't. The gill slits are also further apart and a little more developed in the lamprey larva, but you can see the nerve cord and the notochord and the intestine. Here's our slide of it, showing the mouth and the gill slits. These are parasitic, and what they do is they latch on to fish with this mouth structure, and I'll show you that in a moment, and they rasp open a hole on the side of the fish and feed on the fluids of the fish. And then when they drop off, these wounds get infected, usually with fungus, and it will kill the fish. These got into the Great Lakes when a freighter from the Black Sea flushed its bilges. No ship doesn't leak. There's always small minor leaks, and water gets in and it forms in puddles deep down in the very bottom called the bilge. And they have pumps down there to pump that out. And when they pump it out, sometimes, they pump out larval forms of things. And this has been a real problem with invasive species. Now, in the Black Sea where these guys live, there are predators that eat these things. In the Great Lakes, there are not. Okay, and so they are reproducing massively. Here's what their mouth parts look like. They don't have a jaw, but they've got kind of like a suction cup. And these are sharp, bony little ridges. And then even on the tongue, they have this little sharp, bony thing that can help rasp open an area. And so these guys will latch on and feed off of fish. Here's an example of a lamprey up at the Great Lakes. I mean, they will get up in the shallow water. These things are extremely hardy. It's hard to kill them. Okay. And here's kind of a drawn diagram showing them attaching to a fish. They don't have paired fins. They have very, very primitive gills. They do have an eye, nostrils. Now, let's look at the gnathostomata. These are the jawed vertebrates. And the comparison of jaws. Now, these gill arches in the jawless fishes, the agnathans, it's basically this first two pairs of gill arches become the jaws in more advanced species. This occurs, and we followed this in embryological studies. Now, they don't develop into jaws in this species, but in some of the early fossil species, these two forms of the first two gill arches actually formed into a very primitive jaw, but it wasn't set very well into the tissue, so their bites were not that strong, meaning it wasn't anchored. Okay. More modern jaws are anchored better and can produce tremendous bites. But when we look at shark embryos, the shark starts out without jaws. And then over the course of its development, those jaws are evolved from the first two gill arches. The cartilaginous fishes, these are in the group called chondrichthyes. They have skeletons made up of cartilage. Oldest fossils we found so far, about 450 million years ago. They have some pretty fearsome predators and some more harmless mollusk eaters. It's harmless unless you're a mollusk. A number of shark and ray species are fished commercially or for sport, and this is somewhat of a problem because they reproduce very slowly, and sharks are massacred in huge numbers to feed a growing demand for things like shark fin soup. And so what they do is they catch these sharks, they cut the top fin off, and then they throw the rest of the carcass back in the ocean, just killing them. Here is Snappy. That's my pet great white shark. No, just kidding. These are pretty voracious predators. All the sharks are important parts of the ecosystem. They keep, by culling and eating the weak and sick fish, they keep the commercial fisheries healthy. And this species is migratory. It spends our winters down in the southern hemisphere, and then it transfers and comes up along our Atlantic coast in our summer. They get as far up as Maine, and occasionally people do get attacked by a shark, and that's what everybody always wants to talk about when we talk about sharks, is shark attacks. The most common shark to attack humans is a great white, the tiger, and the bull sharks. If you spend time in the ocean, you have a 1 in 3,700,000 chance of being killed by a shark during your lifetime. But you have to be pretty clueless to get attacked by a shark. It's fairly easy to avoid this, and it's not just staying out of the water. If you're going to go in the water, there are things you can do. The majority of shark attacks are surfers, and I'll explain why. Swimmers and waders, snorkelers and divers, inflatable rafts. A big part of it is people forget that in the oceans, we're not the alpha predator. Okay? The ocean isn't a theme park. There are things out there that can and will kill you. And so you have to have a little situational awareness and a little common sense if you want to spend some time in the ocean. A lot of shark attacks occur when people get too close to sharks. You'd think that would just be a no-brainer. I don't want to get bitten by a shark, so here, I just won't get that close to a shark. But for some reason, some people think that's a pretty important reason and get bitten. Swimmers and waders are splashing around. When you're splashing around, fish that are in distress, which equates prime prey for sharks, splash and thrash around. So it will attack sharks. Okay? A lot of waders are these fish surfers. Basically, they go out into the surf to go fishing, and instead of keeping their bait out of the water, they'll put like shrimp on a line and tie it around their waist. Okay, the shrimp is dead. It is giving off odor molecules that are attracting sharks. So here you've got somebody standing in the surf, splashing around trying to catch fish, and he smells like food. And bingo, they'll take a leg or bite you or whatever. And so, again, if you're going to surf fish and stand in the surf up to your waist, keep your bait in some kind of a container and out of the water. Inflatable rafts and inner tubes. A lot of times people are on top of those and they're paddling. Same thing with surfers. They're on the boards and they're paddling. From the bottom, because sharks attack silhouettes, they look very much like some of the shark's prime prey, like sea turtles and seals, and that's a big part of it. Basically, sharks aren't that intelligent. They look for profiles. From a shark's point of view, okay, they're looking for sea turtles, sea lions, things like that, and human surfers can look very much like some of these prey items, and so they think that that's fair game. Shark attacks USA, these are the total attacks, number of fatal attacks. We don't have a whole lot of fatal attacks, and this is just how many attacks. Now, understand this is probably larger in number, but smaller in per capita than places like Australia or, Africa. Not very many people go on the surf in Africa because it is loaded with sharks. There are these cold currents that start in South Africa and go all the way up the east coast of Africa, and it's almost suicide to go into some of those. In South Africa and Australia, they will put shark nets out to try to protect beaches. Okay, so here's some ways you want to avoid a shark attack. Swim in a group. Don't get too far from shore. Okay, don't be isolated. I know it's like cool to go swimming at night or dawn or dusk, but this is the prime hunting times. So I recommend staying out of the water in the ocean like that. Don't enter the water if bleeding. Don't wear shiny jewelry. Have you ever seen what fish lures look like? They're shiny. They will attract predators' attention. Some waters contain sewage. Sewage attracts bait fish, which attracts sharks. If a lot of people are fishing in the area, stay out of the water. If you see sharks in the water, get out of the water. Uneven tan or brightly colored clothing will show contrast, which will click on a predator response. Don't splash a lot. Don't swim out to steep drop-offs, because those are great ambush points for sharks. And just because you think porpoises are nearby does not mean that the sharks are gone. That was in a television show called Flipper. And there is the TV world and there is the real world. And Flipper doesn't really exist in the real world. A lot of times porpoises can attack you and hurt you as much as a shark. If you see one, don't touch it. That's the really most bizarre one, people trying to swim up to sharks. And if you're attacked, man, do whatever you got to do to get away. I mean, go down fighting. If you smack it enough on the head and nose and don't panic, you have a good shot of surviving. A good example of just paying attention. There were two girls out on kayaks that were so busy taking selfies, they didn't notice a great white shark swimming around and dumped them both into the ocean, and they are quite lucky to have survived with their lives. So keep that kind. Just pay attention if you're going to go into the ocean. Now, humans, in comparison, we kill 20 to 30 million sharks a year, and that's just what we record. Okay, I'm sure probably far more are killed by humans every year. Here's what they do. Food webs in balance. Keep prey populations healthy, removing the sick and the injured. Keep seagrass beds and other vital habitats healthy because it keeps predators are necessary to control overgrazing. In the economy, there have been studies done to show, like in areas like the Bahamas, a single live reef shark over the course of its life is worth about $250,000 because of dive tourism. A lot of people come there to see sharks. So that's ecotourism is one way to look at preserving. Now, why do sharks get killed for that? That is just a shark fin, and these big ships go out and just cut off the fin and throw the rest of them back. And you're thinking, well, how bad can that be? There's one ship full of shark fins for food, so there you go. Let's talk about skates and rays. Stingrays, they have the ability to inject you with a venom. They have a mouth on the bottom. These are they get really tame in captivity, and there's lots of attractions where they cut off the injection part of the tail, and you can go hand feed the rays and skates and things like that. And they used to have one in Nashville, but it closed after the big flood that happened at Opry Mills. Let's look at the bony fishes, the osteichthyes. All right, and here is a phylogenetic tree. These are the bony fishes. There are several branches. The bony fishes come from this group, and then this group here goes into what became the primitive amphibians. These are the lobe-finned fishes, lungfish. Lungfish are really interesting fish that literally just walk along the bottom of the water. And they can survive out of water in the dry seasons in the pools. They have them in South America, Australia, and Africa. And in the dry season, they form this big coating of mud and mucus around them, and they just hibernate. And then when the rainy season comes, it fills up the temporary pools. It softens the mud. They break out. They eat, and they keep cycling. And if they're old enough, they will breathe. They'll breed. The coelacanths were thought to have been extinct until some people found some in the early 1900s in Africa. Okay, and then we go into the primitive amphibians. Some of the other groups that have branched off of the main group, paddlefish and sturgeon. This is where we get caviar from. Some of the gars. This one, the bowfin, is a fish in the southern United States. It has some lobes similar to some of these. Polypterus, this is a predator. Almost looks like an eel, but it's not. Okay. And here's our buddy, the coelacanth. These guys live in extreme depths, in extreme cold. They're not that active. And the only way to actually observe them in their habitat is to go down in the big bathyspheres. And it takes hours to get down there and hours to get back. And these guys pretty much just walk around on the bottom of the ocean eating. They do get pretty large. They live in caves. We know that much about them. Here are the lungfish. And if you've ever seen a live lungfish, you will see them literally, instead of swimming so much, sometimes they will undulate like an eel or a snake, but a lot of times they just walk around on the bottom of the tank. And then here's an angelfish from the saltwater reef. This is an imperator angel. These are the typical fish you would think of, or bass or sunfish, anything you would go fishing for. Now, fish to amphibians. The lobe-finned fish, things like lungfish, form part of the line of living species and fossils that get continuously more legged, if you will. We have quite a few transitional fossils between lobe-finned fish and early amphibians. There's a very early amphibian. Here's one that was a little more of a lobe-finned fish. This was the big one. This one comes from rocks about 375 million years old. It was found by an acquaintance of mine, Neil Shubin. And basically, he was looking for a transitional species between fish and amphibians. And looking at the fossil record, there was a gap in about the 375 million mark. And so he goes, okay, where are rocks that old easily accessible? And there's two places, in Pennsylvania and the Canadian Arctic. So his first choice was Pennsylvania, and he went and spent several years studying the rocks there and never found anything. Then he went to the Canadian Arctic, and they found this one, Tiktaalik. Basically, he's flattened in the front like an amphibian, but he's flattened towards the back laterally like a fish. And this guy was able to kind of like do push-ups and slowly drag himself out of the water. Now, the fossil record in 375 million years ago showed the oceans were pretty hostile. Okay? And so there was a benefit, a survival benefit, by being able to come out and get into the tidal region. You go on a coastline and you have, when the tide's in, there's some water, and when the tide's out, it's separated. And so if you could access some of the more shallow tidal regions, you could lay your eggs and there wouldn't be as many predators that could eat them. And so this is one of the species that did that, Tiktaalik. All right. The amphibians literally means double life, life in water and life in land. All of the amphibians have an aquatic version, like a tadpole, and all of the, and then they also have a semi-terrestrial. Now, how terrestrial they are varies by species. Some, like tree frogs and toads and things, come completely out of the water, and they never really get into anything other than little temporary pools. And then there are things like leopard frogs and certain species of salamander that pretty much still live in the water mostly, even though they can come out. Amphibians, basically the fin is very soft. It's very thin. Usually in some species only one cell layer thick. This is why these amphibians are so susceptible to pollution. They don't have a whole lot of layers of tissue to keep stuff out, and they actually can breathe through their skin by diffusion. And so toxins can get in, and there has been an increased level of amphibian extinction. Lots and lots of species going away, and that can be a pretty big problem. They have a 3-chambered heart, 2 atria, and 1 ventricle. But they don't need a very efficient circulatory system because they can go long periods of time where they're not very active. The most primitive are this little group of caecilians. They're interesting little organisms. Some are like terrestrial, like worm snakes. Some are really aquatic, like rubber eels, but they're actually a little amphibian. And the most primitive amphibian salamanders are called neotenic salamanders, Neotinic. The neotenic salamanders have got these external gills. These are some species of neotenic salamanders. A lot of them are cave salamanders. This is one that, the reason I chose this one is it's in Tennessee, in some cave systems in Tennessee. Now, another one that's very common you can probably see are axolotls. You can find these in a lot of pet shops, and they pretty much live in water all the time. Here's a more terrestrial salamander. This is a spotted salamander, but they still stay in very moist areas. Frogs. Here's a red-eyed tree frog. This is an interesting guy. He spends most of his time folded up and green in a leaf, and you wouldn't even notice him. You could just overlook him very easily. And then if something bothers him, he unfolds and flashes these bright red eyes. Now, red in nature is a warning color. And genetically, it is built into every predator to see red as dangerous. And so it will startle a predator. That gives him a chance to hop away, and then he'll fold up and hide again. Now, the leopard frog. This guy is like a bullfrog, but a little smaller, but they live primarily in water all the time. And these are voracious. They will eat each other. They'll eat anything they can get in their mouth and fit in their mouth. Okay? They have no problems. What's the difference between a frog and a toad? A toad is a species of frog that lives outside the water and only goes into the water to breed in temporary pools. Now, these toads have got these glands here called parotid glands that produce a toxin. If you've ever seen a dog pick up a toad and started frothing at the mouth, it's because this guy can release this toxin to protect himself. This gland here is a modified salivary gland. Okay, and they have a little thicker skin and are able to stay out of water and not be in as moist of an area. The reptiles literally mean creeping. The big thing about reptiles is they develop what is called an amniotic egg. It has a kind of a leathery, hard shell that protects the embryo from drying out so it can be laid on land in moist areas. But it doesn't have to be in the water, which allows them to like bury the eggs and hide them. Now, here is an alligator. This is a very primitive reptile. These guys date back, species of these were alive when the dinosaurs were around. Alligators don't get as big. There's only 2 species alive, the American and the Chinese alligator now. The majority of the species of these are crocodiles. Crocodiles tend to get bigger, are more aggressive. Alligators can get pretty used to people and can exist without attacking them very much. They will attack you, though, and you have to be careful. They're great ambush predators, and they'll drag you in the water just like a croc will, And the first thing when these alligators or crocs get you in the water, they start spinning to disorient you so that you will drown. And then they'll eat part of you, and they'll usually go store the rest of your carcass somewhere to eat it later. There was a very sad case in Florida a couple years ago in one of the Disney resorts. And even though there were signs everywhere saying, don't let your kids near the water. Don't let your kids near the water. Don't let them play in the water side. Don't let them play in the shallow water. A family let their children play around in the shallow parts of the water, and an alligator took a kid. And the father attacked it and tried to get his child back, but we're no match for an alligator in the water. Okay, you're not going to win. And unfortunately, that child passed away, and it could have been avoided. Just, again, nature is not a theme park. There's no way to guarantee safety if you go out into wild areas. Now, how do you tell these alligators and crocs apart? It's easy. The alligators have got this flat, rounded area up here, whereas crocs always come to a point. Okay? Another group, turtles. Turtles are another ancient form, been around a long time. And these guys are a very successful life form. They're eaten and even commercially bred for turtle soup. And you can find them just about anywhere. If there's a big body of water, there's going to be turtles in it. Plain and simple. Tortoises. Tortoises are a type of turtle that lives on dry land. This is a baby sulcata or baby spurred tortoise. They're called spurred tortoises because they have these little modified scales here. These guys can become monsters, 3-4 feet long. These things will live 80 years easily, and they can burrow down 6 feet. These are sold in pet shops to people. They buy them. They're really cute when they're little golf balls, but they keep getting bigger. And when you buy a tortoise, you've got a plan. Okay, you don't buy one of these on a whim, because I'm probably going to have to leave it to my children or somebody, because you're going to have to put this tortoise in your will. If you take good care of it, it's probably going to outlive you. All right? And it's going to get big. So when you buy that little guy, you've got to have a plan for it to, where am I going to put it when it's an adult? How am I going to take care of it? When I get too old to take care of it, who's going to take care of it? There's nothing wrong with having a tortoise as a pet, but it's a long-term commitment, all right? And you'll think, oh, well, I'll just give it to the zoo. There are so many giant tortoises. These sulcata breed like guppies. They're easy to breed. There's tons of them in captivity, and zoos just have more than they can possibly use, so they don't want them. And that's a big part of the problem with wild animals. People buy animals like this, these exotic pets, without thinking it through, and they end up with an organism that they don't want anymore. Then they go release it into the wild. If you can't find a home for your exotic pet, don't release it. Take it to the vet and have it euthanized. All right? I don't think that that's really right, but it's better than destroying the environment by releasing exotic species into the wild. That hurts everybody. Or you could just take responsibility for your pet and buy things by thinking about them. Here's lizards, a pretty advanced group. That's a chordates is what that's called. He's very upset. He can change color, and this is called gaping, and that's a threat display. Snakes, you can get big ones, you can get small ones. At some point when you have children, you may have a cool little kid that wants a pet snake. This is a corn snake. It can easily eat pre-killed rodents, which you can buy frozen and store and feed them. It doesn't get much bigger than 3 feet. It could live its full life in a 10 or 20 gallon aquarium for its whole life. Doesn't need that much space, and they get extremely tame. Now let's look at the phylogenetic tree of the vertebrates. Now this down here is the oldest region, okay, the Paleozoic era, 248 million years ago, and then the rise of the reptiles in the Mesozoic. Mesozoic has the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous. A lot of the animals that you think of as dinosaurs are actually reptiles. So there was an early split. Now, down in the Paleozoic, there was a group of reptiles that arose called therapsids. The therapsids, a good example were the pelycosaurs. If you've ever bought those little bags of plastic dinosaurs, there'll be like a lizard with a big giant sail fin on its back. That's a pelycosaur, and that group of reptiles evolved into mammals. Then you had a break that went off towards right here. It split off, and in that branch we had the pterosaurs, the flying reptiles. We had the crocodilians, right? And then we had the dinosaurs and the birds. They basically refer to them as the birds are the avian dinosaurs, and what we have always traditionally thought of dinosaurs are the non-avian dinosaurs. And the group that is thought to have evolved into birds are primarily the theropods. These are the basically things like velociraptor, stuff like that. And we've now found through fossil evidence the presence of feathers on most of these dinosaur species. Down here, you've got turtles split there. Later, lizards and snakes are kind of some of the newest groups of reptiles. You had the little aquatic ichthyosaurs and the paleosaurs, right? Supposedly one of these still in Loch Ness. Yeah, right. So what you're looking at on this, you're trying to figure out, okay, which evolved sooner, a lizard or a pterosaur? Well, we look here. This is the oldest. So the pterosaurs branched off here. Lizards are more recent. Okay, the ichthyosaurs or the crocodilians. Well, the ichthyosaurs originated down here. The crocodilians up here. So these are the newest groups. This is kind of how you would use this chart. The avian dinosaurs. This is a toucan. Fascinating birds, but kind of aggressive. Don't make very good pets. And mammals. There's a tree rat or a squirrel. Some people eat these. Some people don't. But they are really intelligent little rodents. And anything with fuzzy fur would be a mammal. And that is going to wrap up my discussion of the chordates.